In our last week of class, we had a number of co-curriculars and guest speakers. We covered several key topics such as foreign direct investment, international monetary policy, which was covered by a guest speaker, and African integration, also covered by a guest speaker. Overall, we covered a lot of content in the past week, and I am somewhat limited in my window to discuss it. Therefore, my outline for this video will be to summarize each of the 3 lectures and what I think are the main 1 to 2 takeaways, and then provide some commentary on those points. I will start with foreign direct investment. With foreign direct investment, we first discussed what it is, an investment by a firm or individual in one country in another. We also discussed FDI trends. Some of the highlights included that FDI has increased a lot in the past 25 years due to the shift towards privatized businesses. Also, there's been a shift in where the FDI goes. FDI used to be concentrated in developed countries, however, it has shifted to a more balanced approach and is now in more developing countries as well. Lastly, we talked about M&A in greenfield investments, and then closed with talking about the motives for FDI. The 2 things I found most interesting in the FDI lecture is China's investment in Africa and in African ports, and the impact FDI has had on South Africa. I'm going to touch on something that I will get into in greater detail later. However, currently Africa is receiving a lot of FDI from China, particularly around their ports. However, debt seems to be a reoccurring issue among African countries. This can lead to China seizing assets, including things such as these ports. One of our other speakers talked about African integration, and if Africa does not own its own ports, that could be a huge problem down the line. More specifically, for South Africa, they need to solve the disconnect between FDI and the unemployment rates. South Africa is able to encourage a fair amount of foreign investment. However, this does not stimulate much job growth in their economy. I know this is a more loaded problem than just a disconnect between FDI and unemployment, but I think unemployment is one of the biggest problems South Africa faces, and FDI should be an outlet to address that problem. Transitioning to our next topic, I'm going to talk about international monetary policy. We started that lecture with discussing China's currency and how they have manipulated their currency in the past to stimulate growth and still to a certain extent manipulate their currency. Then we got into the meat and the bones of the lecture and what international monetary systems are. We talked about different kinds of exchange rates, floating, pegged, and managed float or a dirty float. Then we got into the history, starting with the rise and fall of the gold standard. Next, we talked about the Bretton Woods system and why it ultimately failed. Then lastly, we discussed the new system, our current system, which is the floating exchange rate. I had one big takeaway from this lecture. It does not directly tie into monetary policy, but started from the question the lecture was ended on. Should we use a fixed or floating exchange rate? At first, I thought the answer was easy. Floating exchange rates were the easy answer. It seemed the most fair and promoted the most winners. The fixed system appeared to have only one true winner. The one with the best rate and the best economic environment would receive all the business, like China for the past 20 to 30 years, I felt. However, it got a lot more complicated really fast. I think most people would agree the additional pressure and added competition on the U.S. by China is good. Competition forces people / countries / companies and etc. to be better. They have to think a little more about what they are doing. However, since World War II, no one was really able to make a stab and compete with the U.S. until China did. China was really only able to do that on the back of a fixed monetary policy system, along with some other factors as well. And I know monetary policy isn't the only thing that controls growth or what a country needs to compete, but the more I thought about it, having a balance of the two seemed the better solution. It would appear a global environment is better off with the balance of the two systems than having a system that is all in favor of one or the other. Last but not least, we had a great lecture over African integration. The lecture centered around 3 questions: why Africa needs to integrate, the history of regional integration in Africa, and why should Africa adopt a developmental regionalism approach to the African Continental Free Trade Area. This lecture has a lot to it and is a lot to unpack. I think I will spend my limited time providing commentary on his argument. I will talk about some of the things I liked, I disliked, give some pushback on his arguments, etc. First, I think this is an interesting position for Africa's future and the best idea for sustained economic growth. I think the plan is largely built out and is definitely doable. My pushback comes largely in the feasibility of the plan. This plan feels more of an economic thought experiment than a practical solution. And to unpack that, I think the parts of the idea are doable. However, I think the entirety of the program is very unfeasible. For one, I think the world is moving away from this kind of notion. We are seeing an increasing amount of anti-globalization, and agreements like the EU are starting to dissipate. Secondly, I think countries are going to be forced to prioritize themselves. I do think this is one of the easiest problems to overcome. However, I think getting such a large collection of countries to constantly put the group first is a large ask. Lastly, I think the democratic structure makes long-term arrangements such as this difficult. Terms are short by nature, and therefore it is hard to carry a long-term agenda in today's democratic climate. I think overall, these would be a main knock on integration. I do think a half deal or some form of integration will happen. However, I do not think full integration is feasible, as well as such a permanent and long-lasting commitment. In conclusion, these lectures covered an array of content and introduced me to a lot of interesting ideas and concepts, most of which were for the first time. I thoroughly enjoyed these lectures, and I think a lot of the information has real-world application.